But apparently it took about an hour for them to unmask the capabilities that Project Veritas had that just did a pitch mod, and you can actually find that video. Miranda Devine even tweeted it out.
So you've been a special agent for a number of years.
Correct. I've worked in counterintelligence, counterterrorism.
Garrett O'Boyle was suspended for allegedly leaking things to the media. And the thing that was supposedly leaked to the media was a video interview done with Project Veritas and James O'Keefe at the time. I did that interview, not Garrett, which is a big deal, because I know that they suspended my friend, and the other big deal is that the FBI knew it wasn't Garrett too.
So they really made it difficult for Quantico.
Very easy.
Kyle Seraphin. I'm actually sitting on, well, this side of the table. It is a round table, but usually when we do this, it's the other way around.
Right.
The table is turned. But welcome to the Blaze.
Thanks for inviting me up.
Yeah, so glad that you were able to come up and do this with me today. I have to say, you can't seem to stay out of the news. This has been going on for about 2.5 years now, maybe 3.
Right.
And we'll get to that, why we brought you up for this. But for those who don't know who you are, let's kind of start from the beginning, and let's give us an idea of your path to what you now refer to yourself as not a former FBI agent, but a recovering FBI agent.
Sure. Well, it probably starts that I consider myself a husband and father first, an American second, and then distant whatever job it is. Now podcast host, but obviously former FBI or recovering FBI agent. So that's part of it. I was born in California. I grew up in Texas. And I went to college in Oklahoma, so those are kind of the quick touches. I worked a bunch of different jobs, probably like a lot of people in my generation. I'm 42 years old. But at 27, I joined the military. And that really got me on a path that actually made some sense to me. And the line from there is actually a little bit more predictable. Was in the military for just shy of 4 years, got out of my first enlistment, worked for a hospital. I was a paramedic. I was an air traffic controller. And I was trying to figure out, I've got these skill sets that I learned. What am I going to do? And I applied to the FBI, who promptly ignored it. And I worked in a hospital a little bit and kind of did some things. Eventually got picked up by the FBI sort of through the circuitous route, and I don't want to bore anybody with the details of it, but in 2016, I'm actually hired by the FBI and go and get my first assignment out of Quantico at the Washington field office, where I started at the end, November, December of 2016, just as we were about to have Donald Trump come into office. And so one of my first really official duties was walking around in the crowd at Trump's inauguration. It was also my first interaction with the Secret Service. And so that's kind of where the story of the FBI got started.
But it gets started there. Let's go just take a quick step back, though. You started in the military a little late, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what was happening before then? Were you just trying to find yourself? Or?
Yeah, a little bit of that.
Right.
So I immediately before that, I was working as a financial analyst at a movie studio. So I'm working for Warner Brothers. Prior to that, I had run some restaurants. I had also worked in sales, and I'd worked for Dell Incorporated. I'd worked at CBS in a radio gig, also in sales. And my first gig right out of college was that I was selling ergonomic office furniture for an American manufacturer out of Piscataway, New Jersey. Right. I was in the San Francisco office. So yeah, a very circuitous route, not the most logical. Right. And the amusing thing is when I actually ended up at the FBI Academy, everybody wants to talk about, they want to hear, what was your job before this? What is the background that got you here? And so everybody sort of talked about they'd worked for the CIA and they were an analyst, or they'd been a bureau chief overseas working for some newspaper or something like that. And my previous job prior to the FBI was that I was a stay-at-home dad with no kids, which is what I told my classmates at the academy, which got a lot of eyebrows. And I kind of was always that guy. Like, I'm kind of a contrarian. I'm kind of this sort of sarcastic dude. So I pop in there and they're like, what was your last job? And I said, I'm a stay-at-home dad with no kids until I got here. And they went, well, wait, what does that even mean? That's kind of always the guy I've been. Right. I've always been a little bit different. I was 27 going through basic training. So most of my colleagues were 17, 18, and 19 years old. I was the grandpa of the group, if you will, the oldest age you could go through. So I've definitely kind of marched to a different drummer most of my life. Right.
So that brings us to maybe explaining your path to becoming a whistleblower. Because I think so. I would imagine being the contrarian is what led you there.
Also, I started the FBI Academy at 35. Now, I had classmates that were literally a decade younger. You can start at 25. And so I had 25-year-old classmates, and here I am, a whole 10 years more adult life experience. So when someone tells me things, first of all, I always evaluate what's the veracity of that statement. But one of the things that was repeated over and over at the Academy at Quantico was, this is the best job in the world. And my natural question is what other jobs have you had? And when the only other jobs you've had are that you worked for the FBI, I don't believe you. It's a good job.
Right.
It's an enjoyable job. It's a job that many people work very hard to get. But objectively, you can't tell me it's the best job in the world when you have nothing to measure it against. And I had other jobs to measure it against. So that set me apart from my classmates in some ways.
Did you find any additional difficulties of being 10 years older in terms of like the physical requirements? None whatsoever?
No, not at all.
You were prepared for that?
Absolutely, yeah. My previous job in the military had been very physical, so I had spent a lot of time doing physical training.
Right. Okay, so take us right up to the brink. I mean, there were things that were happening. The world was changing. We particularly had a problem. I always refer to it, I always say, when COVID came to town.
Right.
You know, and my life changed, and I think maybe that was the beginning.
That was the strong nudge.
Okay.
I had been worked up to that point, so I had been prepared. I think this is one of those paths that I think God set me on a path, which is awkward for some people to talk about. It's even more awkward for me because if you told me in my 20s that I'd be telling you in my 40s that God had a plan for me and I was living it and I wasn't necessarily a willing participant, that would have been a very strange conversation. But as I joined the FBI, I was immediately disillusioned in my first assignment that what we were doing was not what I was sold. I was told that it was an elite organization. That's not my experience. I was told that it was the best job in the world, and that was also not my experience. It's a decent job, and there are some very fun parts of it, and there are interesting parts of it. But I immediately got assigned to counterintelligence, which is the exact opposite of what you want to take your brand new agent who has the most amount of energy, who's most interested in doing criminal running and gunning type organization, learning the fast-paced turnover. They put me in these long-term investigations. I inherited investigations that were 8 years old into Americans with no allegation of criminality. That was not what I was signing up to do.
Let's go back. What was not elite about it? Because obviously, look, if you're my age, I literally was watching The Untouchables as a kid, all right? And then you're watching FBI in the 60s with Ephraim Zimbalist Jr.
Right.
And so that was where I cut my teeth on the FBI, and it just seemed nothing but elite to me. How is Hollywood not reflecting the actual culture there?
I don't know if the FBI was ever what Hollywood wanted it to be. That's probably the case for all jobs. But I got there and found that the physicality of it was certainly not something that was elite. I'd come from a place where you could lose your job over a PT test. And what I saw at the FBI is that they would make every excuse possible to get you through it, especially if you were a female and especially if you're a minority. That's awkward to talk about because nobody wants to go down there. But let's be real. When there's a guy in my class who has 3 years of work experience, and his work experience was being an unarmed security guard at the Detroit Zoo, and he happens to be black. Now, he's a physical stud, don't get me wrong about that. But his work experience didn't line up with people who had been analysts at the CIA or that spoke multiple languages or were computer programmers. My background was that I was a licensed paramedic. I had military experience, so I went through these different routes. There's probably about a half dozen routes that you can go into the FBI. And some people really seem to have taken the other, and they got it because of what we're now calling diversity hires, DEI, woke sort of ideology. When people come in and they don't have the background that your classmates do, and there's a strong separation, probably a third of the people that I saw in the Bureau were incredibly elite and had every business being there. A third of them seemed like they were selected because they had a really good paper background, but they didn't match up in person. And then a third of them, we were all kind of scratching our heads going, how did this person get here? I don't understand what this person's qualifications are and how are they part of the rest of us? And some of them do well and some of them don't.
Did the DEI aspect of it, was it as prevalent as it is now back in 2016?
It was certainly evident to me that there were people that didn't make any sense. And one of them, I'll just use her initials because I don't need to out her any further, but she was abbreviated EP, Echo Papa, in a lawsuit suing the FBI for unfair hiring practices or unfair firing practices. And she was relieved after 16 weeks in our 21-week academy, and she should have been relieved the first week. She failed or passed at such a marginal level of every single thing she did, including things that were not pass-fail. She failed to be able to hold on to a shotgun while we were shooting 5 rounds of a shotgun. You shoot some buckshot, you shoot a couple slugs, and then they go, now you've seen a shotgun, congratulations. She let it go and almost took somebody's head off. And so safety violations, inability to drive. There was a slalom course where the limit was 2 minutes.
Right.
And the slowest I saw was 2 minutes and change. She did it in about 15 minutes and hit every cone, which were also penalties. So when you watch people do that and they are pushed through all the way to the end, And the only reason that I'm fairly convinced the only reason they actually removed her was because I brought it to my supervisor's attention. I said, look, she said she needs to pair up with me because I know when to draw my gun and when not to. This is not a person you can give a firearm and send into an American city. So I saw that. I saw other women that seemed overwhelmed by the circumstances. I have never seen more crying in a work environment than the FBI Academy. Crying, tears.
How is this possible? Because just this week, there was a hearing in front of Congress. Christopher Wray, director of the FBI. One of the first questions he was asked in the morning hours, have hiring standards been lowered?
Yeah, of course.
In recent years?
Absolutely.
Well, he said no.
He said no. And what I would argue is that Chris Wray is very smart. And he's often approached by people that are trying to get sound bites and they ask very direct questions. You can't get a direct answer from him. He said no. But I imagine they've tightened up criteria that qualify as more rigid or more stringent or equally rigid and stringent, but they've let things go.
Yeah.
The physical capabilities have been dropped. There's no question about it. Agents know this. And additionally, they have brought in backgrounds, like we've been told with very credible information from people that still work at the FBI, that people who are recovering heroin addicts have been brought on as agents, which is shocking because it used to be that certain hard drugs is a no-go and then they had different flexibilities based on marijuana. And there's reasons why you have that, because when somebody has a history of drug abuse, Washington Field, who apparently has this recovering heroin addict, very recently, and people can go out and do the Google search themselves, have had agents stealing heroin out of the evidence locker, and they tied up and destroyed drug prosecutions across the board. Every single thing that agent touched. One of the guys was on my squad specifically because he was no longer allowed to work criminal operations because he was one of the names that this agent had signed. He signed a bunch of other people's names, and they had to change their evidence procedures specifically because of one person stealing heroin. So that's a big liability for a national security organization.
Yeah. Now you said that they put you in counterintelligence. Was not where you wanted to be. Now to me, counterintelligence sounds cool. What was not cool about that for you?
Well, it's the perception versus reality. So what it sounds like is that you're going to be catching spies, which is what they tell you, that you're going to go out there and find bad guys that are betraying the United States and protecting national secrets. And that sounds interesting. The reality of counterintelligence investigations in the FBI is that it's very slow. It's a pace that is meant for seasoned investigators that have a lot of time under their belt, that want to kind of take a step back and work slow, long-term investigations. And the other problem is that we think we're going to go after the criminality of it. That's actually only one facet of CI, counterintelligence. The facet of espionage is what everybody thinks you're doing. But in reality, there's all kinds of other stuff going on. There's counterproliferation, which is essentially people selling night vision goggles on eBay, and protected equipment. There are people that are engaged in influence operations that you're basically just documenting because there's no criminal violation there. There's FARA, I can't remember what it's called anymore, but FARA I was told was a non-prosecutable offense. Up until Mike Flynn, there was no one that was willing to go and push that charge. They said, basically, we sent a strongly worded letter, so thanks for bringing it to our attention. So all of these things are sort of what I would call non-kinetic investigations. They are information investigations. They are intelligence investigations, but that is distinctly separate from criminal. And even the predication required to open them, it's not a criminal act, which shocks most Americans to know that the FBI, probably 50 to 60% of the FBI, is not running criminal cases. They're doing things solely for the sake of learning about what Americans are doing. And it's almost always Americans, by the way.
Well, and certainly we'll get to that.
Sure.
Now, so COVID came to town.
Yep, it did.
How did that change your relationship with the FBI?
What it did is I watched a lot of people in the national security field essentially start phoning it in. They were told, because there were a lot of buyers of the COVID hysteria, that it was too dangerous to go to the office. And so we had federal agents making anywhere from $120,000 to $175,000 a year that were working 30 minutes 2 times a week for a 50-hour-a-week job. That's what we're paid for. Meanwhile, my team, I was on a surveillance team by that point, which is, by the way, like the lowest rung on the ladder in the FBI. I was like, where's someone not going to mess with me? Because I don't want to do that job. What does nobody want?
Right.
Oh, they don't want surveillance? That's where I want to go. And it turns out to be one of the most fun jobs you can do. We're chasing bad guys. We're looking at criminals. We chased bank robbers and child pornographers, and we saw potential terrorists. Many of those are mostly inflated. But we got to see at least that work, and I got to touch all the different sort of entities. And I was in 20 states in 2020. So I went all over the country. I was in Florida. I was in Portland. We went to Albuquerque. We were like running wild because the bad guys didn't stop, but a lot of law enforcement did, at least on the federal side. So it dramatically changed what was going on there. And what I also saw was, after Donald Trump transitions out, Joe Biden comes in, a whole new animal goes to town. And right at the same time that Joe Biden is swearing in, I'm applying for other positions. I was trying to go to Montana. I was trying to go to an office nobody wanted to go to, what was called a Tier 1 hardship.
Why would you do that?
Because I didn't want to be in Washington, D.C. I had lived through what had gone on in 2020.
Okay.
I'd watched the inability of federal law enforcement to react to what happened outside of the White House when they put Trump in the bunker. I was on front lines the day after they put him in the bunker. My entire surveillance team drove down in covert vehicles that we had to take the license plates off so that the Antifa types didn't recognize us. And we stood the line with Secret Service because they'd run out of people in the uniform division. They had guys in the hospital, women in the hospital that had been hit in the head, that were recovering from concussions. So here we are, helping stand the line in front of the White House while they're erecting the anti-scale fencing, and they're trying to put a line between the the attackers essentially and these like wild protesters and what law enforcement was willing to do. So I saw that, and it was disruptive to my faith in what was going on.
Where were you on January 6th, 2021?
I was in Frederick, Maryland, and I was out at a shooting course. This was actually reported on by Ryan Riley, which is kind of funny because they said I laughed about it. I did laugh about it on January 6th. I'm out there with all these cops, and they're either ESU or SWAT for Maryland State Police and the local counties that are around DC. And we're out doing this red dot pistol shooting course. I took leave. If this was the kind of event that it ended up being, it should have never been approved, the leave. But here I am in Maryland. We're out there shooting, and then all the guys' pagers or their cell phones start popping, and they're all getting these text messages. You're going to have to report in. Mutual aid required, the Capitol's been overrun. And then we start seeing the videos. And the videos that we saw out there on the field while we're on the shooting range is, like a guy wearing a spiked helmet. We saw, Jake Chansley and marching around. And it's utterly ridiculous because how in the world did that even happen? So we're laughing about like someone stole the gavel, someone's walking off with the lectern. Like what is happening at the Capitol? We go away for one day and this chaos happens. But the broader point to me, I knew I didn't want to be on duty if I could help it. And I knew I didn't want to be in D.C. because I had friends that told me, hey, I'm going to go down to the rally. I'm going to take leave and I'm going to go support President Trump. A lot of FBI agents are relatively conservative. And so there were people that wanted to go out there that day. And I talked them out of it. And their careers were saved because of it. And they know it too. I mean, they're not public suspendables the way that we've sort of adopted that brand. But
So was January 6th a Fedsurrection?
I don't think so. I think you've done as good as anything. I've actually learned a lot about it from you, but the federal government looked, at least on the FBI end of it, absolutely flat-footed and unprepared. So that doesn't mean that there weren't elements operating. Here's the wild thing about it. Everybody looks at the federal government as a monolith. And that's not the case, and I know that's not the case. Even the FBI is not a monolith. So there are a couple of things that were moving in place at that time. Number one, we know that the FBI sent out what we call a canvas. That's like an email request for all agents. Does anybody have a source that is going to be traveling to January 6th or a source that we could task to go there? So that happened. The FBI wanted to know what's going on, but that's not unusual. They send people into Sturgis, the motorcycle rally, because there's a lot of people, and when a lot of people get together, there are potential federal violations, interstate lines crossed. So you send people to these things.
They send people to Taylor Swift concerts.
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not. But I wouldn't put it past them.
No.
Because if that's a security event, you send people there. What they do when they're there is another animal, and the type of source that they are is also another animal. And for January 6th, the sources were mostly what we would call CT sources or domestic terrorism sources.
Right, but we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they had at the very least surveillance teams, looking for potential problems.
Yeah, I've been on those things.
Right. And then of course we know beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Proud Boys were heavily infiltrated.
Yes.
We know that the Oath Keepers, not quite as heavily, but they also were infiltrated. Even their number 2 man was a CHS for the FBI.
Sure.
Does that in and of itself ring nefarious, or is that a look? Let me rephrase that. Being more of a libertarianish kind of political animal myself, I've always thought of government, moral government, as being actually the only moral function of government is to protect its citizens from force and fraud.
Sure.
So I don't have a necessarily, a knee-jerk response against federal law enforcement agencies or local if they're doing their job and they're limiting their scope to that.
Yep.
Did you see or have you heard? I mean, you were working. You weren't in D.C. on the day, but you worked out of the Washington field office.
Right.
Is there anything you heard or saw that caught your attention or raised your eyebrows?
I sat on my medical bag because I was a paramedic, and I sat on the medical bag in the SWAT team room the days afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And what I heard were the typical things that you would hear after an engagement with a potentially hostile group of people. Like if you go into something and someone picks a fight with you, you're naturally hostile towards them. And they had that attitude. So the guys that were on the SWAT team down there, they're like, hey, I knocked this guy over. He tried to get in my face and I pushed him over. And like, that's fair play as far as I'm concerned, like man's man type stuff. But as far as like we were setting this thing up and we executed an operation, from what I understand, two things happened at once. One, the FBI was flat-footed. They didn't have the command post set up. They didn't have my surveillance team employed. And my team was the kind of guys, like we spent our time in plain clothes. We had specialized equipment. We had more training. We're not the best in the world, but we're good. We're good enough. And we would oftentimes walk around in things. We would also volunteer to be what they call I teams, which is like investigative teams, 2 by 2, walking around, plain clothes, looking for problems, calling them out to investigators that would go say, hey, you just dropped a backpack down there. They're going to go check the backpack, and we want to know who you are and what you're doing. Why are you dropping backpacks in the middle of the park? So those are all protections of First Amendment liberties, in theory.
Right.
I don't have any beef with those, and I didn't see anybody saying otherwise. But what we also saw, or heard rather, was this ideological bend, which started in 2020, and I saw a sympathetic stance towards BLM, which was concerning to me because they were obviously being infiltrated, whether it was all BLM people or Antifa or otherwise. They were people that got out of control and caused violence. We had to have what looked like a green zone in Washington, D.C. And most people don't know this, but there were sandbag positions set up during the winter of 2020 where National Guards troop parked a deuce-and-a-half truck in the middle of a street, and they set up sandbags. They were unarmed, but they were just standing around milling about. There were federal agents who are not security troops marching around with rifles and body armor as like a presence patrol. That's not the America that I want to live in. Right. And so there was already that lean, and what we heard was that the senior executives within the Washington field office, including a woman named Jennifer Moore, who comes into play later, she was one of the SACs, and they all sort of agreed that this is our 9/11. This is our opportunity to make political hay on the biggest case, which it's kind of predictive. It's a self-licking ice cream cone. That's the government analogy. But when you decide, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. When you decide it's going to be the biggest case that you've ever worked, and you decide to put all the resources behind it, it becomes the biggest case you ever worked. That's what happened with January 6th, from my perspective within the Bureau.
All right, let's get past January 6th. The event itself, but you were nevertheless pulled in,
right? Because
something that I've spent a lot of time on is the issue of the pipe bombs.
Yep.
I particularly focused on the issue of the DNC pipe bomb, the one that was found outside of the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
Yep.
You got pulled into that investigation. How did that happen?
So we were peripheral. We were basically an asset to anybody to be tasked. And everybody was getting tapped to do the thing they do. My team did surveillance. So what do you do when you're that? You go and pattern of life people. You find out potential subjects. You try to figure out if they're actually living where they want. So we get a brief. We report out in Northern Virginia to a fire station, and we're read in on, here's what we've got. Now, these details are always a little bit of a game of telephone because it's not the actual case agent working the case, and there were a lot of things happening at that time. But we get brought in, and a guy comes out from a counterterrorism squad, and he says the following. He's like, we got an individual who's been identified through cameras. We traced the route of movement, who supposedly dropped a pipe bomb or two, in D.C. We traced them to a metro station. The metro station is both time-stamped and has key card or your paid, Metro card access. And that was also bought with a credit card. That credit card has a name associated with it, obviously. And so we were able to timestamp the person through these cameras, through the turnstiles, getting into a Metro car, leaving a Metro car, leaving that station. And incidentally, the name that was associated with the credit card that bought that Metro card also was the name that was part of the registration for the vehicle that picked this person up. Now that's a slam dunk in the surveillance world. We rarely got more than here's a license. We think this person drives a white 4-door sedan and they live in this neighborhood, and we would go find them still. Like, we're pretty good at that. So when you tell me that this person was tied through essentially a security camera link directly through financials, and those all line together in the financial, we call it like tying out. They all tie to each other in a really meaningful way.
So did you think you found the bomber?
Well, we found at least a place to start, and that's
Okay.
what you would normally do. You don't know that that person was driving the car. You don't know that the person who's registered or has that, but somehow that person knows who they picked up in their car or that someone borrowed their car. It's a place to start, right? If you borrow my car on that night and I go, hey, 2 days later, hey, who borrowed your car on that night?
Right.
They will tell you. They know. Or they won't tell you and they're lying to you. That's
Yeah.
okay too. But we had at least a place to start. And so I actually volunteered because the problem with the way the FBI is set up in the national security realm, because it is slow investigations, and I learned this working CI, because of the way that they want to cover up sources and methods, and they're used to getting things through secret process. They don't necessarily build criminal cases. They don't want to go do the standard law enforcement knock and talk interview, which means, hi, I'm from the FBI. Would you have a few minutes to talk to me? People talk. They shouldn't, but they do.
Right.
And so I just said, look, if you guys are scared of doing this, I used to do sales. I have no problem knocking on the door. The person that we had identified had a background in the Air Force. So let's have a chat.
Right.
And that was turned down. The next day, not because I asked, but the next day we were pulled into the office and told we had to shag leads that were coming in through the 800 number and the tip lines that were on the internet, which was just a mess. I mean, it was 500,000 leads, if you believe what Matt Taibbi said. And I believe him. There were 20 to 30,000 at a time that were in the queue to be evaluated, and we had to go through every one of them. And they were mostly garbage saying, I knew Steve Baker when he was in high school, he was a big fan of Reagan, I think he's a jerk, and I hope that bad things happen to him, and you guys could knock on his door and find out where he was on January 6th. No other information, just I hate Steve Baker, so go look at him, FBI.
Right. But were they pulling you off of something that you thought was a valuable surveillance?
Sure,
That,
I mean,
that could have led you
like,
to solving this, unsolved crime.
Well, the wild thing is stepping back from these number of years now and looking back at it and going like, how in the world did they not have enough? The cell phone data being corrupted. When you tell me that you've traced somebody on a camera and you've given me a name and an address and a physical location and a car and a description like that, and they had all that, unless they got it all wrong, which is a possibility, I'll leave it open. But like I said, that's a slam dunk in the surveillance world to get started. And to pull us off for something that anybody else could have done. Not everybody has the covert vehicles, the experience, the time, and specifically, that's what our squad did. They're literally called the Special Operations Group. It's the Intelligence 21 Squad. That was what I was assigned to. What we did was watch people. And so we had equipment, and we had radios, and we had telephoto lenses, and we sat in cars for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week or more, looking for this sort of thing. That's what we did. We found people.
But there's one very particularly interesting part of this investigation. You were told something about from one of your supervisors, your superiors, about the nature of the bomb itself. Is that correct?
Right.
And what
Well,
was
that actually was in the briefing. It was in the original briefing.
Right.
Because when you work surveillance, you want to know some things about your target. Is this a witness? Is this someone who's not a threat to us? Oh, is this an MS-13 gang member? Have they allegedly hacked people up with a machete? I want to know that.
Right.
Like, what is my threat? You
Right.
know? And so the thing that we asked was, if this person was dropping bombs, 2 questions. Do we think there are more devices? And what was the viability of that device?
Right.
Those are very simple questions. Basic, what we would call agent or officer safety questions.
And the answer to part 2 of that question was what?
Not viable.
They were not viable devices.
Right.
So-
Inoperable.
Yeah.
Looked very bomb-like was the quote that I remembered.
And yet, going back to Christopher Wray and others, here we are 3.5 years later, and they still will not admit that publicly.
Right.
They still talk about the dangerous nature of that bomb, that it could, in fact, cause death or serious injury.
Right.
They still continue holding that line. Now, you look back at it 3.5 years later, and you've been able to, I'm sure you've been interested. You maybe have read some of myself and some other
100%.
stories on this. What's your evaluation 3.5 years later?
We have a lot of people that worked for or with the FBI that are willing to fudge the truth or use shaded versions or definitions of the word viability, I think. I was shocked to learn that my name was brought up independently by the former assistant director in charge of the Washington field office, a guy named Steve D'Antuono. Now, I didn't meet Steve D'Antuono, but I know people who knew him. I knew people that dealt with him at the FBI Academy that had seen his whole career. And I don't have any personal animus because I don't know the guy personally. Right. But what's funny is he's under questioning with Thomas Massey and answering questions, which I'm only reading in written form, the transcript of it. But he independently brings up, I don't know what Kyle Seraphin learned, but I was the ADIC of the office. That's what we call him, ADIC, A-D-I-C. And I'm the ADIC, and that's not what I learned. And then not 2 minutes later, he's saying, look, I was the ADIC. I wasn't involved in the case. I don't actually know these things. The other thing is he throws some shade on whether or not, this is what the experts at the Charlie demo range, I don't know if he calls it that, but that's where they work out of. This is what the experts in the bomb disposal unit for the FBI and the investigative post-blast guys, this is what they told me, that it was, viable. Well, does viable mean that it had wires, like an initiation device, it had powder, some kind of explosive, and a casing? Because there are probably like some check boxes you could say,
right.
Does it have all the requirements to look like a bomb? The question is viability for me is, will it actually explode? Can you initiate it with the things you have to expect it to do the thing that it was designed to do? Or is it a prop? And that's a real serious question for someone who's going to actually go out there and potentially find someone with one of those things. Now, he made, this is funny because Steve D'Antuono says, I don't know what Kyle Seraphin knows about explosives, because most FBI agents have never probably dealt with explosives.
Right.
Now, I'm not an expert by any means. I'm not an EOD technician, but I spent 100 hours with a demolition training in the military, and I've used C4, and I've used military and commercial dynamite, and I've done electric and non-electric demolitions. So I know more than he does if I had to guess. I'm just going to say he was an accountant, and I was in the military doing stuff where we did demo. That's funny to me. That's one of those quirky things. Why would you bring my name up to specifically discredit it unless that was an actual threat to what was, the lie that they were telling? And to me, having seen what they have done recently, I know they don't have a problem lying to Congress.
Right.
As long as they think they're not going to get caught.
Is this a failure by FBI to identify who placed those bombs, or give me your 30,000
Catastrophic. It's a catastrophic failure. Listen, the FBI, for all of the incompetencies that exist, and it's a federal agency and there are plenty, it's not that bad at doing its job. As I said, we would get thin information on a regular basis and find people. A lot of it would feel like luck, but luck tends to favor the prepared. And if you have the right equipment and the people that are trained properly, and they go out and do the basic mechanical things, it's like the fundamentals of basketball, right? If you know how to dribble and you know how to pass and your team knows a couple of different plays, you can move the ball down the court. Now, you may get beaten by a more sophisticated team, and that happens.
Right.
There's a joke at the FBI Academy, we only catch the dumb ones, right? So, and that's true about criminals. You do catch the dumb ones much more easily. But the idea that they would have all of those resources, and it's the biggest case the FBI's ever worked, the fact they didn't catch the most terroristic person on that day that will forever live in infamy is absurd to me on every level. It defies credulity.
Were those two devices, viable or otherwise, were they diversionary devices?
I can't say I wasn't there. I mean, it looks like it, right? Because they're pulling things away. And from watching the reporting you've done, so this is just me as a guy speculating at that point, do they look like they are a diversion? Yes, because I don't understand what they have to do with anything else. And I've heard all the same things everyone else has, is that certain people speculated, like a Ray Epps, like, oh, I was there to make sure that there were no pipe bombs. And that's a very specific thing to say. So people say weird things. And when you're an investigator, you don't really believe in coincidences, but you don't also believe in broken lines that don't have a direct connection. So you say that's unusual, but until proven otherwise, it's just unusual. But you always file it in the back of your head.
So let's move forward in time a little bit, because after COVID, January 6th, now you're on a crash course with becoming a whistleblower. So
what I found out, because you don't know, I mean, you take the trainings like every other federal employee does. There's a whistleblower training that every federal employee gets. And it doesn't really sink in until you actually have to go and do that thing, because why would you pay attention to it? It's like, okay, these are the general strokes of it. Obviously, I'm not supposed to be retaliated against. Fine. My whistleblowing activity actually started in at least 2018 and definitely some in 2019. But this is saying there's an official process problem. You bring it within your chain of command or otherwise, because there's a lot of routes you can go to be a whistleblower. You can bring it to your direct supervisor and say, I think we're violating a rule or a policy or a law. You can say, this is fraud, waste, and abuse. I've done those things in multiple ways. So I'm kind of a pain in the butt as an FBI employee by bringing these things forward. I actually sent a letter to the Office of General Counsel saying that they were abusing our surveillance resources and they were breaking federal employment law. No follow-up on that way. They probably owe me back pay for like a lot of overtime.
I'm always amazed when I hear you talk about these things, and when you and I have had hours-long conversations in the past, is that you remember the minutia of not just the federal acronyms and but you remember the names of all the documents and the files and all of these things. But there's an actual process of being a whistleblower. So you're saying before you actually went through, and you're going to have to explain this so that because I'm not going to get it right. But before you go through the process of being recognized as is it a legal whistleblower or an official?
There's just a law. And so this is the funny thing. So Democrats have said, well, your agency has done an investigation and determined that you're not a whistleblower. So we don't recognize you as a whistleblower. The agency doesn't.
Right.
So let me say that in a different way. The government has investigated the government and found that the government did nothing wrong.
Right, right.
Take that for whatever that's worth.
Right, but but before you were going through any official process, if there is such a thing, you were essentially, as you said, whistleblowing on fraud and waste, or
and that is
dysfunction.
that's what a whistleblower is. A whistleblower is someone who meets the statutory definition of performing a whistleblower act. And so you go to an approved source with information in reasonable or good faith belief that there is something wrong in these following categories. So it's rule or law, or it's fraud, waste, and abuse. You have to take it to the right person, someone in your chain of command, someone in the IG, the Inspector General's office. You can take it to a member of Congress, which you have 2 different protections for doing it that way. And as long as you do that and you have a reasonable belief that those are violations, you're doing so in good faith, then that's a whistleblower. Okay. So there's not really an adjudicative process that needs to be done. The default position should be—
There's not a form?
There's no form.
There's no form for that.
No,
See, I was always under the impression that as a federal employee, and if you were going to whistleblow, you would pull the form, because they got a form for everything else.
They do.
And that you would pull the whistleblower form and you would file it, and get it signed off by the right person.
Right.
But that's my ignorance. Now, having said that, there was a time when your activities of being a pain in the butt as an employee got you in trouble.
Absolutely.
Explain how you got there.
So I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, because my wife and I were trying to figure out how do we get out of DC. The environment felt threatening just to having little kids. So I had my third child in March of 2021. And while we were at the hospital, we got orders to move to Las Cruces, a job that I applied for. I found out later that there were 2 spots and 2 people applied for that job. So very highly contested location to move to Las Cruces, New Mexico. I had friends asking me, like, is that an extraterritorial post? Are you outside the United States? I'm like, no, it's in New Mexico, man. And they're like, is that an American state? Yes, of course it is. So geographical ignorance aside, I take this post to move out there. And because it was in the middle of the COVID hysteria, we bought a house on FaceTime. I want to give people just a sense of what it took to go and do this.
Yeah.
My wife had a difficult delivery. We had a little bit of problem afterwards. I'm buying a house on FaceTime in a city that I've never been to, because I couldn't leave her, or I didn't want to leave her and go do a housing experience. So I basically found 2 realtors who would drive around and do FaceTime and decide whether or not and I used my skills from being a surveillance guy, because I regularly flew into new places, and I did map studies of the areas. I asked about it. I talked to the supervisor in the office and said, hey, I've narrowed down a couple of neighborhoods. If you were going to live here and you were buying a house, where would you live? And he told me 2. I chose one of the 2 correctly. So I lived in the same neighborhood as my boss. So that was good. So we buy this house. It turns out really great. We move out to Las Cruces, and I start working there officially on the 1st of June. June is always a big month for me. The 1st of June in 2021.
21.
Correct.
Oh, wow.
So right after March, basically we got out there, I think in April. I was on paternity leave. I got a couple of weeks off. They had just passed this thing through on the Trump administration. So I got some extra time off. And I ended up going, I think we were actually boots on ground in May.
Okay.
And we start work officially. I started going to the office because I want to know what's going on. And like, if you're a guy that wants to do action, I want to know what my new job is.
Right.
And my boss gave me an opportunity. He said, you got 2 choices. You can either work public corruption, which is a little bit slower, or you can work the Indian reservation, and there's a lot of stuff there. And I'm like, give me the Indian reservation.
Right.
I want to go do that. I drove 100 miles each direction to go to work when I went to the res, because that's the work I wanted to do. I was like, I finally get to do some criminal investigations.
So you were working outside of the territorial United States.
Kind of, yeah.
On the reservation.
Well, it's U.S. territory, but it's not state territory.
Right,
Yep.
right. So, all right, so now get us to the point then where you are on the brink of, well, frankly, losing your job.
Sure.
Because of your whistleblowing activities.
So it's always more than one thing, which is how the Bureau actually hid behind a lot of this stuff. While I'm in New Mexico, first of all, I'm an award-winning FBI agent. I won an award right away because somebody couldn't find one of the computers in our Las Cruces office. That was part of the Albuquerque division. And so an email goes out and says, if anybody can find this computer, they're going to get an award. So I looked over to my right at the computer that was just next to me, knowing how federal employees work, saw that the serial number was the appropriate one and sent it off, and was given a 4-hour off extra piece of leave. Wow. I won my first award like within my first couple days there. So that's funny. It's obviously that's very silly. I also had been given an award at my previous post by Jennifer Lee Moore for being an outstanding surveillance guy and running that team. So here I am, I'm at this new spot, I'm working my butt off, and I'm like, this is awesome, I love this place, I've got a beautiful view, I'm living in this great house, and we're not done with COVID yet, because in September of 2021, the Biden administration comes forward and says every single federal employee is going to get a COVID shot. We are making a mandate.
Right.
Which seemed immediately illegal to me because I wasn't a member of the military, and I remember doing that. You lose a little bit of your sovereignty, not as much as they would have you believe, but you lose a little bit of sovereignty there. But that's not the case for a civilian employee. I could quit at any time. And so I filled out a religious accommodation request. Now, my wife had been going through RCIA to become a Catholic. I'm a lifelong Catholic, and I came back to the church when I had kids, so not a perfect person by any means, certainly not a spokesperson for that. But we were getting more and more religious as we were seeing more and more people see fear in the world. And we're like, we're people of hope, and we're going to see that. So September, that happens. That's step one. And I file this religious accommodation request, which puts me on the radar. Everybody who filled out a form saying they were going to do it knew they were on the list.
Right.
You're now an objector to the Biden policy,
Right.
which I've referred to as a compliance purge to Jim Jordan's office, and they used those same words when they talked in the press. Almost immediately afterward, within maybe a few weeks, I'm walking through the office, and I get this supervisor who's working intelligence stuff. He's an intel analyst. And he said, "Did you see that email?" And of course, I have no idea what he's talking about. And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "Well, it just came out to the 14s. That's the first level supervisors." And I'm a 13 at that time. I'm a GS 13, so we're different pay grade. And he said, "I'll send it to you." I don't know why he sent it to me. Again, I feel like God's plan is sort of like these crooked lines that make a straight path. So I get the email, and I open it up, and I immediately took a walk and made an appointment to go talk to my member of Congress. Because the email came from two places, the FBI's criminal division, but also the FBI's assistant director of counterterrorism.
Okay.
And what it said is that we were going to introduce a threat tag, EDU officials, that was going to tag investigations that were threatening school officials, which I knew because I'd lived in DC and I pay attention to the news like a weirdo. I watch all this stuff, and I knew that Merrick Garland had just gone in front of Congress not 5 days earlier and said that the FBI would not be using resources to investigate parents at school board meetings using specifically counterterrorism resources. Right. And here we are seeing an email suggesting that the counterterrorism division is involved in this, because the AD of counterterrorism signed it.
Right.
That's a no-brainer for me. That looks like perjury. My allegation was never that the FBI can't investigate parents. I don't want them to, but they can. I mean, I'm a parent. But there has to be an interstate nexus. There has to be a federal nexus for a federal violation of crime. And if you go in Congress and you say, "Listen, I'm not going to do this thing," and then a week later we get an email saying that we're doing that thing, either the AD is incompetent or he's perjuring himself.
Right.
Either one is unacceptable. I brought that to my member of Congress in October of 2021.
And then I would imagine it started picking up momentum. From this
That
point
was
forward.
that was kind of the cloudburst moment, I suppose. Maybe a couple weeks later, my boss walks by right when this goes public, because it went public in the second or third week of November in 21 again. And my boss looked at me and he said, "You're a whistleblower, right?"
Right.
Insinuating the affirmative.
Yeah.
And one of the fastest ways to get kicked out of the FBI is what's called lack of candor. That's the actual official term for lying.
Yeah.
So you don't do that.
Right.
I also know from the whistleblower training, which I took a week prior to that conversation, that you can't ask somebody if they're a whistleblower. You're not supposed to. It's inappropriate.
Right.
So I answered in the affirmative, which he already assumed.
Yeah.
But how did they know that? Because I didn't tell anybody that.
But you had a don't ask, don't tell policy that they couldn't ask the question.
They're not supposed to, as I understand
supposed
it.
to.
Yeah. And I'm open to being wrong on that, but that was my recollection at the time, and I'm sure it's true.
And then the next thing you go through is you're having to deal with not just the aftermath of the vaccine mandate, but you're getting forced testing now, right?
Right. So there was all this. First of all, the FBI handled COVID differently in every single one of the 56 field offices, and I know that because I created a group on an encrypted chat application called Signal, where we had 300 different FBI employees, agents, technicians, what are called MAPAs, different types of analysts and so on, and even a couple of like mid-level supervisors. So we had all these folks in there. We all knew that they were handling it differently. And what we also knew was that there was a workforce that was headed by Dr. Fauci that had recommendations on the required things that federal agencies were supposed to do, like a uniform mandate, like the federal government would do. Yeah. And they were coming out, as far as I remember, it was called the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force. It has that kind of dumb name. Yeah. And it required certain behaviors. They were not abiding by them in the FBI. They said everybody must test for COVID, and they must submit a completed test with negative results every 72 hours, which meant that everybody was testing every 48.
Yeah.
And I said no.
So you're in the news again, very recently, in the last couple of days.
Sure.
I think we're about to that point in time that is about to reveal how we got there, right?
Pretty close, yep.
Yeah. So let's do it in reverse.
Okay.
Tell me what happened in the last week, and then take us back to the moment that this new reintroduction of Kyle Seraphin to the American public started.
Sure. So we're revisiting a moment from about 2 years and change, which was in May of 2022. And what has essentially been done is that publicly, Empower Oversight, who is representing whistleblowers like Marcus Allen and my friend Garrett O'Boyle, Steve Friend at various times, they have come forward and they've introduced letters to Congress laying out the fact pattern that Garrett O'Boyle, who many people remember will say, this government will crush you. He's a bearded, mountain of a human being, and one of the people that I love most in this world right now. He's just an awesome human being. Garrett was suspended for allegedly leaking things to the media. And the thing that was supposedly leaked to the media was a video interview done with Project Veritas and James O'Keefe at the time that was done with a voice modulator and a shield and a shadow, like pixels reduced away to kind of shield the identity of it. And he was taken off the FBI's payroll in September of 2022. What they revealed at Project Veritas, at Empower Oversight, which is something obviously I've known, is that I did that interview, not Garrett, which is a big deal, because I know that they suspended my friend, and the other big deal is that the FBI knew it wasn't Garrett too.
So they knew it wasn't Garrett.
Right.
And for how many months did they go through the process of basically destroying Garrett's life? Because his story is incredible.
It is incredible. So it started in September of 2022, and he is still not paid, still an indefinitely suspendable FBI agent. So theoretically, he's a federal employee with no benefits, no paycheck, no badge, no gun, no authority, not accruing anything, and we're waiting for him to be, righteously vindicated, which he should be at some point.
Essentially falsely accused.
Accurately falsely, totally falsely accused.
And because they accused him of doing something that you did.
Correct.
Explain how they would have known that, the FBI.
It's wild. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we had a 300-person group in this encrypted chat that I set up. Now the idea is that the FBI was doing divide and conquer. Every single field office handled things differently, which meant that everybody had a different experience, and everybody thought they were the only person that wasn't going to abide by the shot mandate. I knew that wasn't the case because, one, I've been a paramedic for a while, and I understand how people handle medical stuff, and two, the raw math of it said that at least 10% of this FBI has to be some sign of conscientious objectors. So I went out there and I found those people, word of mouth only, and we created this group. Garrett was in that group. Okay. Garrett was in the Kansas City field office. We never worked together. We'd never met in person. We simply were part of the same chat group that I was sending out inspirational messages and letting people know, you're not alone. Other people also do that. And through that, we had the ability to go one-on-one. And Garrett and I, through this chat, were like, we made this connection where he said, you're really aggressive about this. You're taking action. You seem like you're doing this thing. I said, yeah, I'm going to Congress and I gave them 4 pages of handwritten notes of what is going on that is wrong in the Bureau for the time that I've been there. Yeah. And he said, I've been doing the same thing. I've also been trying to get my member of Congress interested, and I've got some other stuff. So we started trading notes. Maybe in March, we started talking about Project Veritas. So we had this connection, but nobody knew about it. The reason they knew that Garrett and I were connected, the only reason they knew, is because we both also agreed that we were going to get crushed in the offices that we were working in, that there was no way we were going to survive it, based on the political temperament and the way that people were leaning. I actually had a mutual acquaintance of Garrett and I, a guy that worked in the Kansas City field office, call me up in November of 21. And he said, I just got off the phone with the Office of General Counsel in Washington, D.C. Apparently your chief legal guy called into D.C. and said, I've got a problem. I've got someone who's refusing the COVID vaccines. He won't test. And he's a whistleblower. What should we do? They turned around and called Kansas City, and Kansas City, the employee there said, you should promote him, which is hilarious. But at least I knew that they knew that I had already been a whistleblower. Right. They used that words, and I guarantee if there is, it may just be a phone call, but there's probably text messages or emails going back like that.
So we don't have to get into all the technicalities of how you kind of in a clandestine sort of way worked your way up to do this recording with Project Veritas.
Sure.
Because you knew that you were putting your career on the line, and you knew that you had to pull this off without being caught, right?
Correct. But the thing, so the timeline is actually fairly important. The document that actually ended up being disclosed went to Congress, went to a bunch of different members of Congress's staff. My attorney and I blasted it out as far as we could get. And then I was suspended in April, before the video was made.
April 22.
Correct. But I was still being paid.
All right.
They were going through the formalities of it. And I knew the minute they kicked me out of the office, because it was the second time that I was kicked out of the office. The first time was November 23rd of 21. I went until March 4th of 22 with no pay and not being allowed back in the office. They let me back in because Biden changed the COVID rules. And suddenly everybody was allowed. This was the State of the Union, by the way. The State of the Union allowed the federal government to change the rules. Suddenly it was fine. So suddenly now I'm allowed back in. I'm put in a corner for 6 weeks with no job. And then I'm removed from my duties and responsibilities. My badge and my gun are taken from me. And so I'm sitting there at the end of April. And I still have this document that that Garrett had shared with me to get to Jim Jordan's office and others.
Okay.
And I'm looking at it. And now I've got time away from the office. I've got free time, and I'm reading what is going on with that case with Project Veritas and realizing that the Southern District of New York is making an argument that that document, which has no case information, by the way, it simply says the name of the case managers, it says what the threat tags are that are assigned to that case, and the type of case that it is, without even the name of the subject, although we know what it was. That's all that's on there. And the fact that the FBI used what's called a SIM process on it, same as you would be, by the way. A news media organization. That's what it calls, news media, sensitive investigative matter. I see that they're arguing the other way in the Southern District of New York. They're saying that nobody would consider these people journalists and nobody would consider them news media. And I know that to be false because I'm looking at the document.
Right.
So I made a decision. This is not the way that our country is supposed to work. And this might cost me something. That was pretty obvious to me. But we cannot have organizations, whether you like them or not. And to be fair, there are things that Project Veritas did that I liked, and there are things that I did not like. And I wasn't particularly a big fan of the way that James O'Keefe carried himself. Completely irrelevant to whether or not the American federal government can come in and say, you're not a journalist, we're going to crush you. So I essentially saw this, and I think I told you this privately, but this is the way I saw it. It's like seeing one of those 80s movies where there's a sword fight and the hero doesn't have a sword and somebody kicks him a sword and gives him a fighting chance.
Right.
I at least made the government stand on their own 2 feet and say, if you're going to call them non-media, why did the FBI call them media? And that should have been over to them in discovery if they were defending themselves.
Did you see the document that Garrett sent me recently, just in the last week?
Maybe.
It's actually the FBI's definition of media.
Oh, I have seen that, of course.
You've seen it.
Yeah, absolutely.
By every definition.
It's changed a couple of
I
times.
was media on January 6th.
Absolutely.
Even though I wasn't working for the Blaze or a large media organization.
So there's a lot of First Amendment law that is, it's a really dangerous ground for courts to weigh in on. I talked to Ron Coleman, who works at the Dillon Law Firm, and one of the reasons why the courts assume that your religious beliefs are sincere when you make a religious accommodation request under like the EEO or Title VII is because the court doesn't want to get into the business of what is a good Christian, what is a good Catholic. In the same way, there should be no adjudicative process on the government end is what is a journalist in the era of independent media and social media and so on. They don't make that. In fact, social media influencers, podcast hosts, they're all media, according to the FBI, and that makes sense because it's press.
All right, so you went to Project Veritas. Yep. You sat down for an interview with James O'Keefe.
Yep.
And they blurred you out.
Yep.
And they altered your voice. And that should have been the end of it, but unfortunately, that wasn't the end of it.
That was not the end of it.
What happened?
My paycheck was removed on June 1st. That was sort of assumed. I knew that the steps that I'd already taken, like they were already going to get rid of me. It was very clear to me that between the whistleblowing activity and the fact that I wasn't getting the COVID shot, I made my peace on that.
Right.
So there was always the possibility the FBI would come in and confront me about this information. Now, here's the weird part. When I was walked out of the office in April of 2022, I was made to sign a document, or asked to sign a document, which I did, that said they are removing my badge and my gun, and I was relieved of all duties and responsibilities as an FBI agent, direct quotes. So I show it to my attorney, and I said, does an NDA hold up at all if they've relieved me of the duties and the responsibilities of the job? And he goes, I don't know. And I don't know that anyone knows. It's very gray, it's very vague, it's weird. Right. I said, so am I even violating anything if a document that I got that I didn't get in the line of work, I didn't go get it because I was doing work, I was actually trying to give it to Congress, and we did. I've now decided to go do something that is outside of FBI policy, but I'm certainly not breaking any laws by doing so. So I brought it to them, and that should have been the end of it, or they should have come after me for it and said, hey, by the way, we're firing you because we think you violated our policy. That's not what they did. They went after Garrett.
Okay, so the Project Veritas interview was in May.
Correct.
Of 22. When did they come after Garrett?
September 26th.
Between May and September, did they discover that this was you?
So we have a whistleblower that says yes. Obviously, I wasn't part of that investigation, so I can only speak from what other people have said.
Right.
But apparently, it took about an hour for them to unmask the capabilities that Project Veritas had. I actually talked to someone from the remnant of Project Veritas this week, and she was shocked to learn that the FBI had the capabilities of basically doing a voice pitch mod of 20%. Essentially, that's all they did. They took James's audio and they played it at regular. They took mine and they shifted the pitch by 20% down to make it deeper and grovelly. And this was actually affirmed by an anonymous internet account on Twitter, or X now, that just did a pitch mod. And you can actually find that video. Miranda Devine even tweeted it out, that showed that that's all you had to do to get to my voice.
So they really made it difficult for Quantico
That's a good sarcastic.
to fix this.
Very easy.
Yeah. So they knew that this was not Garrett.
Yes, which honestly, that actually makes me feel a little bit better that they're not as incompetent as it would have otherwise been. Because imagine the amount of incompetence it would take to not be able to identify one of your own agents in an internal investigation. And by the way, because I was an employee, even though I wasn't paid and I didn't have a gun, like they had extra authorities to go after me.
So where does this put you today? I mean, are you under any threat right now legally? Are you in jeopardy in any way?
Nebulous answer to that. It's unclear. So if the FBI does what a judicious organization that cares about the truth would do, then no. But we don't really believe in that at this time. And there's some evidence. I had somebody come to me, friend of a friend, that said there are meetings taking place currently at the Hoover Building with people from DOJ who are trying to figure out what is the angle to jam up Kyle Seraphin and stop him, and that you're not going to be in the clear for a couple of years. So hold on to your hats. And then the second piece of the evidence that pops up on that, which is probably more disconcerting to me, is that former Twitter, now X, was subpoenaed for Garrett O'Boyle's social media records, inception to date, login locations, all the things that they can find out from that. And so was mine. Now, his attorneys were contacted by DOJ, and AUSA called up and said, we're no longer looking at your client. He's not the subject of an investigation. He's not a target.
AUSA being
a federal prosecutor.
Assistant U.S. Attorney.
Yep. I did not get that phone call to me or to any attorney that knows me. And they have some names for friends of mine who have acted as my legal counsel. And moreover, the email that shows that there was a grand jury subpoena in the District of D.C., that Twitter basically they unmasked it and they sent it off to Garrett O'Boyle directly via email saying after 6 months, this is no longer under seal. They also unredacted my name. There's no way that they would know that I know Garrett O'Boyle or that we're friends or that he would share that with me, but he did. And my name and my account are also being targeted.
So what could they charge you with?
So I was told obstruction of justice. That was the tip that I got. So you go looking through the statutes.
The same January 6th famous 1512 C2?
So there's a bunch of 1512 different paragraphs. And the only one that could ever align with anything that I've ever done that you would have to really bend into a pretzel to get to is that 1512 C2. Yeah, the same thing that was just overturned with Fisher.
Are you heavy-hearted about this?
I'm treating it the same way that you would treat any sort of like impending danger when you have something to do. When I was in the military, the scariest thing I ever did was jump in cold, dark water and go swim to the beach because I'm terrified of dark water. It's just a phobia I have. But the reason you get through it is because you have a mission, and so you just focus. So all I'm doing is saying, every day I get up in a podcast, I say what I know is true. Every single day, I contact people in the FBI. I give interviews left and right and give, I think a pretty straight opinion. I have a lot of former FBI that appreciate that I will cut fairly when it's fair, but I will slice deeply against the agency. So that's what I do. I don't have any time.
Is Garrett O'Boyle in the same jeopardy?
Very possibly, because they've already referred him for perjury based on his testimony in front of Congress. Now, we know that they don't have the evidence to back it up. In fact, if they ever tried to bring the case, they would end up, coming after Kyle Seraphin.
So to bring this kind of to a close here, I mean, first of all, Kyle, thank you. Thank you for, your bravery. Thank you for standing up for what's right, inside of a federal organization like that, and one that I have very, very negative,
justifiably,
feelings about. You told me something a day or two ago about your daughter having witnessed. I mean, basically, she's been here while you've been going through all of this.
Sure.
This has been her life. She's watched Dad go through all of this.
Yep.
Tell us what your daughter said.
So I've got 4 kids. 3 of them are girls. And my oldest is 7 now. When she was 5.5, we moved into a house in Texas because we lost the house that we lived in Las Cruces. I sold it because I didn't have an income. We moved into some space that my daughter witnessed, like staying with my parents at 40-something years old, and 2 bedrooms that they had extra in their 3-bedroom house. And when we moved into our place in Texas, we say a blessing before the meal, grace over meal. And we all hold hands, and my daughter asked if she could say the blessing, which is an unusual thing for my 5.5-year-old at that time. But she felt comfortable. She said, bless this food and bless our family and keep us safe from our enemies. It's a very simple, short prayer. My wife and I kind of looked at each other with kind of wide eyes. And you don't want to, act like that's something that is wild. So you look over at your daughter, and I said, honey, that's beautiful. Who are our enemies? And she said, the government, the FBI. And that's a really wild take for a 5.5-year-old to have seen what has gone on with Dad. And she tells the story when she goes out to the playground and meets some new mom. She's gregarious like every other little girl. But she's my most aware of what has happened. And she started seeing this at 3.5 years old. So her entire life, we have essentially been working aggressively against the government to keep the government where its checks and balances are supposed to be, because it's gotten out of its normal limits. And she sees that. And if a child sees it, every American should be concerned at that point, having seen what it does to our family.
Where can we find you? How do we keep up with you going forward?
Yeah, super easy. So people can find me on Locals, and I have a redirect there. It's just KyleSeraphin.com, or if you want to follow me on social media, it's at Kyle Seraphin. I use the name. It's just who I am. I'm just standing behind my face, my name, my words. I take accountability for all of them.
Your podcast is on Rumble?
It is, and well, yep. And they can find that either on Locals or on Rumble.
Kyle, thank you, man.
Thanks for having me in, bud.